This is HOA mess. Let me set the scene fast. I measured it, and you failed. That was the first thing Amy Lee said when she cornered me at the mailbox cluster on a sweltering June afternoon in St. Paul, Minnesota. I had just pulled in from a custody exchange, still holding my car key fob in a clenched fist, and she was already standing there with her clipboard in a clear plastic sleeve and a portable thermal printer balanced on the mailbox post. She pointed a flashlight beam at my porch even though it was still light out, and told me I had violated Section 12.4 of the Harbor Point Records Compliance Association standards. I asked her what she was talking about. She slapped the clipboard and said the landscaping service I hired had parked in the guest zone for 11 minutes instead of 10, and that made me liable for a vendor compliance surcharge of $300. I told her I did not hire anyone that day. She said she had a witness list and she would not let me see it. I work as a court interpreter and I know how hearings actually go. I know what witness lists look like, and I know you do not spring them on someone at a mailbox. I told Amy I wanted to see the list and the evidence packet before I paid anything. She smiled and hit a button on the thermal printer, and a violation slip rolled out warm into her hand. She handed it to me and said I had 7 days to file a response, or the fine would double and the HOA would place a lien on my property. I looked at the slip, and the date was wrong by 2 days. I pointed that out and she said the date did not matter because the violation was continuous. I asked what continuous meant, and she said any vendor activity that exceeded the guest zone time limit triggered a rolling compliance review period. I had never heard that term before. I asked where that rule was written, and she tapped the clipboard and said it was in the updated standards that went into effect last month after a special vote. I asked for a copy of the vote, and she said it was in the portal, but my access had been suspended pending the compliance review. That was when I knew something was very wrong. I moved to Harbor Point 6 months earlier because the custody schedule with my ex required me to be close to her new address, and this was the only neighborhood in range I could afford. The HOA seemed normal at first. Standard rules about trash cans and lawn height and parking, but within 2 weeks I got my first notice. It said my mailbox flag was the wrong shade of red. I replaced it. A week later, another notice said my porch light was too bright and violated the nighttime ambience standard. I installed a dimmer bulb. A month after that, I got a notice that said I had failed to submit a landscaping plan, even though no one told me I needed one. Every time I fixed something, Amy found a new problem. She was the pool and amenities chair, but she acted like she controlled every inch of the neighborhood. She carried that clipboard everywhere, and she wore a blue baseball cap and a white windbreaker even in the heat like she was on patrol. Neighbors avoided her. The landscaping contractor I hired told me he had worked in the neighborhood before, and he always made sure to park in the street because Amy timed everything. I went inside and logged into the HOA portal to check the updated standards. The page would not load. I tried 3 times and got an error message that said my account was under review. I called the management company and got a voicemail that said they were closed for the day. I texted my friend Marcus, who works at the courthouse, and asked him if an HOA could suspend portal access without notice. He said it sounded shady and I should file a records request immediately to get copies of everything, including the vote Amy mentioned. I drafted the request that night and emailed it to the management company and copied the board. The next morning I got an auto reply that said records requests required a processing fee of $75 and a notarized affidavit of residency. I had lived there for 6 months and paid dues every month, but apparently that was not proof enough. I printed the affidavit form and drove to a notary during my lunch break. The notary charged me $12. I mailed the packet with a check and a tracking number. 5 days later, I got a response. It was a single-page letter that said my request was denied because I had failed to specify which records I wanted, and the HOA was not required to produce speculative searches. I read the letter twice. My original email had listed 7 specific items, including the updated standards document, the vote minutes, and any vendor compliance policies. I forwarded the denial to Marcus and asked him what I should do. He said I should file a formal complaint with the state HOA ombudsman and also check if anyone else in the neighborhood had fought similar enforcement before. He said sometimes HOAs run the same playbook, and if I could find a prior case, it might give me leverage. That night, a neighbor named Greg knocked on my door. He lived 3 houses down, and I had seen him at the mailbox a few times, but we had never really talked. He said he heard I was having trouble with Amy, and he wanted to warn me. He told me that 2 years ago, a couple named the Caldwells lived in my house, and they had fought the HOA over a similar enforcement issue. The Caldwells had hired a contractor to replace their deck, and Amy claimed the contractor violated noise ordinances and guest parking limits. The HOA fined the Caldwells almost $2,000 and threatened to lien the property. The Caldwells tried to fight it, but they said the board kept changing the hearing dates and losing their submissions. Eventually, they sold the house and moved. Greg said he always thought something was off about that case because the Caldwells were meticulous people and they had documentation for everything, but the board acted like none of it existed. He said he was telling me this because he did not want to see the same thing happen to me. I asked Greg if he remembered any details about the Caldwell case, and he said the only thing he saved was a neighborhood group chat thread from that time where people were talking about it. He pulled out his phone and scrolled back 2 years and showed me a message where someone said the HOA had paid a vendor to verify the Caldwell's deck work, but the vendor was never named in any official document. Another message said the board vote to approve the fine happened at a meeting that did not have a quorum, but the minutes were filed anyway. I took screenshots of the thread and thanked Greg. He said to be careful because Amy had a way of making things personal, and she did not forget. The next day I got another notice in my mailbox. This one said I owed an additional $500 for failure to respond to the original violation within the 7-day window, even though only 6 days had passed. The notice also said the HOA was scheduling a board hearing for the following week, and if I did not attend, they would vote to approve the fines and begin lien proceedings. The hearing was set for Thursday at 6 p.m. at the management company office. I checked my calendar, and I had a custody exchange scheduled for 6:30. If I missed the hearing, I would default, and if I missed the exchange, I would violate the custody order. I called the management company and asked if the hearing could be moved. The woman on the phone said hearing dates were set by the board and could not be changed for personal reasons. I asked if I could attend remotely, and she said no. I asked if I could submit a written statement, and she said the board preferred live testimony. I was trapped. I could not afford to lose custody time, and I could not afford to let the HOA default me into a lien. I called Marcus again and told him what was happening. He said it sounded like the HOA was trying to box me in, and I needed to force them to slow down. He suggested I file a motion to continue the hearing based on a scheduling conflict and cite the custody order as a protected obligation. He walked me through the process, and I drafted a motion that night and emailed it to the board and the management company. I got an auto reply that said motions required a 10-day advance notice and could not be filed within 72 hours of a hearing. The hearing was in 5 days. I stayed polite. because polite makes bullies careless. I showed up to the management company office 15 minutes early on Thursday. The office was in a strip mall on the south side of St. Paul, and the lobby was crowded with people waiting for other meetings. There was a sign-in table near the door, and Amy was sitting behind it with her clipboard and her thermal printer. She looked up when I walked in and smiled. She said I needed to sign in and provide a photo ID and proof of residency. I handed her my driver's license and a copy of my deed. She looked at the deed and said it was not acceptable because it did not have a notarized signature. I told her the deed was recorded with the county, and that was proof enough. She said the board had implemented a new credentialing standard for hearings, and without proper proof, I could not be admitted. I asked when that standard was implemented, and she said it was part of the updated rules. I asked for a copy of the updated rules, and she said they were in the portal. A woman sitting near the table looked up and said she had attended 3 board meetings, and she had never heard of a credentialing standard. Amy ignored her and told me I could wait in the lobby until the board decided whether to allow me in. I said I had a right to attend my own hearing, and she said the board had discretion over attendance, and they would make a ruling after they convened. Another man in the lobby stood up and said this was ridiculous, and he pulled out his phone and started recording. Amy immediately stood and told him recording was prohibited in the office. The man said he was recording because he was witnessing what looked like a procedural violation. Amy picked up her radio and called for the property manager. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more real HOA drama and justice stories. The property manager came out from the back hallway and asked what was happening. Amy pointed at the man with the phone and said he was disrupting the meeting process. The property manager looked at me and asked if I was the homeowner scheduled for the hearing. I said yes, and I showed him my ID and deed. He looked at Amy and told her the deed was sufficient and I should be allowed to sign in. Amy said the board had final authority and the manager was overstepping. The manager said the meeting could not proceed without the respondent present, and if she wanted to delay the meeting she could, but it would require rescheduling. Amy stared at him, and then she tapped her clipboard and told me to sign in. I signed. She printed a visitor badge from her thermal printer and handed it to me. The badge had my name and the word respondent in large print. She told me to sit in the lobby and wait to be called. I sat down next to the man who had been recording. He introduced himself as Alan and said he lived 2 streets over and he was there for a separate hearing about a fence complaint. He said Amy had tried to block him from signing in last month using a similar excuse, and he had to bring his lawyer to get admitted. He said the HOA had been escalating enforcement across the neighborhood, and a lot of people were getting hit with surprise fines and hearings. He asked me what my case was about, and I told him. He shook his head and said it sounded like the same pattern. He said a friend of his had been fined for vendor parking last year, and the hearing was scheduled on a holiday weekend when half the board was out of town. The vote went through anyway, and his friend paid the fine because he could not afford to fight it. Amy called my name 20 minutes later. I walked into the hearing room and the board was already seated at a long table. There were 5 board members, including Amy. The board president was a man named Donald, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Amy sat at the far end with a stack of file folders. She opened the top folder and said the hearing was convened to address vendor compliance violations at my property, including unauthorized guest zone parking and failure to submit a landscaping plan. She said the total fines were now $800 plus processing fees, and if I did not pay within 30 days, the HOA would file a lien. I asked to see the evidence, and she slid a single printed page across the table. It was a photo of a truck parked in the guest zone. The timestamp on the photo was from a date I was not even home. I pointed that out, and Amy said the timestamp was not relevant because the violation was continuous. I asked what continuous meant again, and she said any vendor activity within a rolling 14-day window was aggregated for compliance purposes. I asked where that rule was written, and she tapped her folder and said it was in the updated standards. I asked for a copy, and she said I should have accessed it in the portal before the hearing. I told her my portal access was suspended, and she said that was because I was under review. One of the other board members, a woman named Helen, interrupted and asked Amy if the respondent had been given access to the updated standards prior to the suspension. Amy said access was not required if the respondent had failed to maintain compliance. Helen said that did not make sense, and she wanted to see the policy. Amy said the policy was in the folder, and she would provide it after the hearing concluded. Helen said she wanted to see it now. Amy hesitated, and then pulled out a stapled packet and handed it to Helen. Helen flipped through it and said the policy was dated 3 weeks ago, but the vote to approve it was dated 5 weeks ago. She asked how a policy could be approved before it was written. Amy said the date on the policy was a clerical error, and the vote was valid. Helen asked if the meeting minutes from that vote were available, and Amy said they were in the records archive. Helen said she wanted to review them, and she moved to table the hearing until the minutes could be produced. Donald seconded the motion. Amy said tabling the hearing would violate the enforcement timeline, and the fines would automatically escalate. Another board member, a younger man named Paul, said he did not remember voting on any vendor parking policy 5 weeks ago. Amy said the vote happened at a special session, and Paul might have missed it. Paul pulled out his phone and checked his calendar and said there was no special session on his schedule. Amy said the session was called on short notice due to an emergency compliance issue. Paul asked what the emergency was, and Amy did not answer. Helen repeated her motion to table and asked for a vote. Donald and Paul raised their hands. The other 2 board members looked at Amy and did not move. Helen said the motion carried, and the hearing was tabled pending production of the meeting minutes and the vendor parking policy approval vote. Amy slammed her clipboard on the table and said the motion was invalid because it did not have a full quorum. Helen counted the hands and said 3 votes was a majority of 5. Amy said 2 board members were absent, and their proxies had been assigned to her for the meeting. Helen asked to see the proxy forms. Amy said they were filed with the management company. Helen asked the property manager who was standing near the door, and he said he did not have any proxy forms on file for this meeting. Amy stood and said the hearing was concluded and the fines were approved by default. Helen said that was not how the process worked, and she was calling for a formal vote to void the enforcement action pending a full investigation. Donald and Paul raised their hands again. Helen raised her hand. The motion carried. Amy said the vote was invalid and she was filing an appeal with the management company. Helen told her to sit down and stop disrupting the process. Amy grabbed her clipboard and her thermal printer and walked out of the room. I stood there not sure what to do. Helen looked at me and said I should go home and wait for a follow-up notice once the investigation was complete. She apologized for the chaos and said the board was going to review all recent enforcement actions to make sure they followed proper procedure. I thanked her and left. On my way out, I saw Amy standing in the parking lot talking on her phone. She was pacing and gesturing, and I could hear her saying something about witness protection and legal fees. I kept walking and got in my car. I had 15 minutes to make the custody exchange, and I barely made it on time. The next morning, I got an email from the management company. It said the board had voted to pause all pending enforcement actions pending a policy review, and my fines were temporarily suspended. The email also said my portal access had been restored. I logged in and downloaded every document I could find, including 2 years of meeting minutes, budget reports, vendor contracts, and enforcement logs. I spent the weekend reading through everything, and I started to see a pattern. Over the past 2 years, there had been at least a dozen enforcement actions related to vendor parking or landscaping violations. Every single one had been initiated by Amy. Most of them had resulted in fines between $500 and $2,000. In almost every case, the homeowner had either paid the fine or moved. The few cases that went to a hearing had minutes that were inconsistent or incomplete. In 3 cases, the minutes listed board members as present, who had confirmed they were not at the meeting. In 2 cases, the minutes were signed by Amy, even though she was not the board secretary. I called Marcus and told him what I found. He said it sounded like Amy had been running a parallel enforcement system and possibly forging meeting minutes to cover it up. He said if I could prove the minutes were falsified, I could file a formal complaint with the state and possibly trigger an audit of the HOA finances. He asked if I had any hard evidence like original sign-in sheets or recordings. I said I did not, but I could file a records request for them. He said I should also check if any of the vendors Amy cited in the enforcement actions were real or if she had been inventing them. He said sometimes HOAs create fake vendor invoices to justify fines and then pocket the money. I filed another records request asking for vendor contracts, sign-in sheets, and audio recordings of any meetings where enforcement votes took place. The management company responded 2 days later and said recordings were not kept and sign-in sheets were destroyed after 1 year per the retention policy. They attached copies of 3 vendor contracts, but 2 of them were unsigned, and the third was with a company that had gone out of business. I searched the company name online and found a state business registry that showed the company had dissolved 6 months before the contract was supposedly signed. I had enough. I called a lawyer Marcus had recommended who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Jennifer, and she agreed to do a consultation for free. I sent her everything I had, and we talked on the phone for an hour. She said the evidence pointed to systematic fraud, and if I wanted to pursue it, I should file a formal complaint with the state HOA division, and also consider filing a lawsuit for harassment and wrongful enforcement. She said the lawsuit would be expensive and could take months, but the state complaint might trigger an audit that would force the HOA to produce records and answer questions under oath. She said the key was to prove that Amy had acted outside her authority and that the board had either enabled her or failed to stop her. She said the best leverage I had was the falsified meeting minutes, because that was a clear procedural violation that could void every enforcement action tied to those meetings. I decided to file the state complaint. Jennifer helped me draft it, and we attached copies of the minutes with the date discrepancies, the unsigned vendor contracts, and the group chat screenshots Greg had given me. We also attached a timeline showing how Amy had escalated enforcement against me within days of each compliance action. The complaint was 30 pages long, and I mailed it certified to the state HOA division. The tracking number showed it was delivered 3 days later. A week passed, and I did not hear anything. Then I got a call from the property manager. He said the state had contacted the management company and requested copies of all meeting minutes and financial records for the past 3 years. He said the board was convening an emergency meeting to discuss the audit, and I was invited to attend as a witness. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening. He said Amy had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. I showed up to the meeting early and the lobby was packed. At least 20 homeowners were there, including Greg and Alan, and a few people I recognized from the prior hearing. Helen was standing near the door talking to a man in a suit who I assumed was the HOA lawyer. Amy was not there. Donald called the meeting to order and explained that the state had opened an investigation into HOA enforcement procedures and financial controls. He said the board was cooperating fully and they had hired an independent auditor to review the books. He said the purpose of tonight's meeting was to hear from homeowners who had been subject to enforcement actions over the past 2 years and to determine if there were any patterns or procedural violations that needed to be addressed. One by one, people stood and told their stories. A woman named Sandra said she had been fined $1,500 for a mailbox color violation, and when she tried to appeal, the hearing was scheduled on a day she was out of town for her mother's funeral. A man named Kevin said he had been fined for a landscaping violation, even though he had submitted a plan and received written approval from the board. He said when he showed the approval letter at the hearing, Amy claimed it was a forgery, and the board sided with her. Another woman said she had been fined for vendor parking, and when she asked to see the photo evidence, Amy refused and said the photo was confidential due to an ongoing investigation. Each story was worse than the last. The pattern was unmistakable. Amy had been targeting homeowners with selective enforcement, falsifying records, and manipulating the board to approve fines that had no basis in the actual rules. Helen stood and said the board owed everyone an apology. She said it was clear that proper oversight had failed, and the board had allowed one member to operate without accountability. She said the board was committed to making things right, and they would begin by voiding every enforcement action initiated by Amy over the past 2 years, and refunding all fines paid. She said the board would also be reviewing the HOA governing documents to implement stronger checks and balances so this could never happen again. The room erupted in applause. Then the door opened and Amy walked in. She was not wearing her windbreaker or her baseball cap. She was dressed in business casual and she was carrying a leather binder. She walked straight to the front of the room and demanded to be recognized. Donald said she was on administrative leave and could not participate in board business. Amy said she had a right to defend herself and she had evidence that would exonerate her. Helen said this was not a trial and the board was not making any final determinations tonight. Amy ignored her and opened the binder and started reading from a prepared statement. She said the enforcement actions she had taken were all authorized under the updated standards, and the board had voted to approve those standards at a special session 2 months ago. She said she had the meeting minutes to prove it, and she handed copies to Donald and Helen. Helen flipped through the minutes, and her face changed. She looked up and said the minutes were dated correctly and appeared to have signatures from all 5 board members. She asked Paul if he remembered signing them. Paul took the copy and studied it and said the signature looked like his, but he did not remember attending any special session. Helen asked if anyone else remembered the session. No one raised a hand. Amy said the session was called on short notice, and not everyone attended, but the quorum was met with proxies. Helen asked to see the proxies. Amy said they were filed with the management company. The property manager stood and said again he had no proxies on file for that meeting. I raised my hand. Donald recognized me, and I stood. I said I had filed a records request 2 weeks ago, and the management company had sent me copies of all meeting minutes for the past 2 years. I pulled out my phone and opened the file and said the minutes Amy just handed out did not match the version I had received. I asked if I could show the board. Helen said yes. I walked to the front and handed my phone to her. She compared the 2 versions side by side and her face went pale. She said the version I had was missing the last 2 pages, and the signature page was completely different. She asked the property manager where the version I received came from. He said it came from the official file. She held up Amy's copy and asked where this version came from. Amy said it came from her personal records. Helen said that was a problem because official minutes were required to be filed with the management company within 10 days of a meeting, and there could not be 2 versions. She asked Amy when she had filed the version she was holding. Amy said she filed it the day after the meeting. Helen asked the property manager to check the file timestamp. He pulled out his laptop and logged into the system and said the file I had received was uploaded 2 months ago. He said there was no record of any other version being uploaded. Helen asked Amy to explain. Amy said the management company must have lost the updated version. The property manager said the system kept an audit log of all uploads and deletions, and there was no deletion record. I asked if I could say something else. Helen nodded. I said I had compared the signature page on Amy's version to the signature page on other meeting minutes from the past year, and the signatures looked identical. I said it appeared someone had copied and pasted the signature page from a prior meeting and attached it to new minutes. I pulled up a side-by-side comparison on my phone and handed it to Helen. She looked at it, and then she looked at Amy and said this was serious. She asked Amy if she had fabricated the meeting minutes. Amy said she had not, and the comparison was meaningless because people sign their names the same way every time. Helen said that was true, but the signatures on Amy's version were pixel-perfect matches down to the pen pressure and angle, and that was not possible with a physical signature. The room went silent. Amy closed her binder and said she was not going to sit here and be accused of fraud by a homeowner who had refused to follow basic compliance rules. She said she had spent 2 years trying to maintain standards in a neighborhood where no one else cared, and this was the thanks she got. She said she was resigning from the board effective immediately, and she walked out. The door slammed, and no one moved for a solid 10 seconds. Helen broke the silence and said the board would be meeting in executive session after this meeting to discuss next steps. She said the audit would continue, and if any criminal conduct was found, the board would refer the matter to law enforcement. She thanked everyone for coming and said the board would be sending out an update within the week. The meeting adjourned and people started filing out. Greg came over and clapped me on the shoulder and said that was the most satisfying thing he had seen in years. Alan said he wished he had recorded it. I said I was just glad it was over. But it was not over. 2 days later, I got another envelope in my mailbox. It was from the HOA attorney, and it said the board had completed a preliminary review of my case and determined that I was owed a reimbursement for my expenses tied to the bogus enforcement and the tow threat. The letter included a check for $1,200 covering my records request fees, notary fees, legal consultation, and a discretionary amount for time and inconvenience. The letter also said the board had voted to void all fines assessed against my property and to issue a formal no-contact order prohibiting Amy from initiating any further enforcement actions or communications with me. The letter said the audit was ongoing and additional findings would be shared with homeowners as they became available. I deposited the check and called Marcus to tell him. He laughed and said I had basically done the state's job for them. He said the HOA probably wanted to settle fast before the audit uncovered worse things. I asked him what he thought would happen to Amy, and he said if the state found evidence of fraud or embezzlement, she could face criminal charges. He said at a minimum, she would never serve on an HOA board again. A week later, the board sent out an email update. It said the independent auditor had identified multiple irregularities, including unapproved vendor payments, missing invoices, and discrepancies in the enforcement fee ledger. The auditor had also found that Amy had approved payments to a landscaping company that did not exist and had deposited the checks into an account under her control. The total amount was over $30,000. The board said they had referred the findings to the St. Paul Police Department and the county attorney. The email also said the board was implementing new financial controls, including dual signatures on all checks, quarterly audits, and a requirement that all enforcement actions be approved by a majority vote of the board, with minutes filed within 72 hours. The neighborhood group chat exploded. People were posting screenshots of old enforcement notices and comparing notes. It turned out Amy had been running the same scheme for at least 3 years. She would target homeowners with bogus violations, escalate the fines, and then either force them to pay or scare them into moving. The money she collected went into the HOA general fund, but she was also skimming by approving fake vendor invoices and pocketing the payments. The board had been too passive or too trusting to notice, and by the time anyone raised questions, she had enough control to shut them down. Greg messaged me privately and said he felt guilty for not saying something sooner. He said he had suspected something was wrong with the Caldwell case, but he had not wanted to get involved. I told him it was not his fault, and the important thing was we had stopped it. He said the Caldwells had moved to Wisconsin, and he was going to reach out to them and let them know what happened. He thought they might be able to file a claim for damages now that the fraud was confirmed. 3 weeks later, the board held another meeting. This time, Amy was not just absent, she was banned from the property. The board announced that the police investigation was ongoing, and Amy had been charged with theft by fraud and forgery. The board also announced that they had recovered most of the stolen funds by seizing Amy's vendor accounts and freezing her assets pending restitution. They said homeowners who had paid fines under Amy's enforcement actions would be receiving refunds over the next 60 days. The board also said they were revising the HOA governing documents to eliminate the pool and amenities chair position and distribute enforcement authority across the full board. Helen was elected board president by unanimous vote. She stood and said the past few months had been a nightmare, but the neighborhood had come through it stronger. She said the board was committed to transparency and accountability, and she invited any homeowner with concerns to reach out directly. She also said the board was planning a neighborhood cookout in July to rebuild community trust, and she hoped everyone would come. The cookout happened on a Saturday afternoon in the common area near the pool. I brought my kids and we grilled burgers and played cornhole and talked to neighbors I had never met. Greg introduced me to the Caldwells, who had driven down from Wisconsin. They thanked me for reopening the case and said they were working with a lawyer to file a claim against the HOA for the money they had lost. They said they were not interested in moving back, but they wanted to make sure the HOA paid for what had happened. I told them I was glad I could help, and I was sorry they had gone through it. Later that afternoon, Helen pulled me aside and said the board wanted to recognize my role in exposing the fraud. She said they were planning to name the new transparency policy after me, but I told her that was not necessary. I said I just wanted to live in peace and not have to fight the HOA every week. She laughed and said that was fair. She also said the board had voted to reimburse my filing fees to end the fight, and she handed me another check. I thanked her and put it in my pocket. As the sun set, people started packing up and heading home. I helped fold tables and pick up trash. Alan came over and said he was thinking about running for the board next year. He said the neighborhood needed people who would actually stand up to bullies, and he thought he could do some good. I told him I would vote for him. He grinned and said he would hold me to that. I drove home that night feeling something I had not felt in months. Relief. The HOA was no longer a threat. Amy was facing charges. The neighborhood was healing. I could focus on my job and my kids and not spend every evening combing through meeting minutes or drafting records requests. But the story did not end there. A few months later, I got a call from a reporter at the St. Paul Pioneer Press. She said she was writing a story about HOA fraud, and she had heard about my case from the county attorney's office. She asked if I would be willing to talk on the record. I said yes. The story ran 2 weeks later, and it included interviews with me, Greg, the Caldwells, and Helen. It detailed Amy's scheme, the board's failures, and the reforms the HOA had implemented. The story got picked up by a local TV station, and I did a short interview on the evening news. The exposure led to other homeowners in other neighborhoods reaching out to say they were dealing with similar problems. Some of them asked for advice, and I shared what I had learned about records requests and state complaints. The county attorney eventually offered Amy a plea deal. She pled guilty to theft and forgery and was sentenced to 2 years probation, a $10,000 fine, and 500 hours of community service. She was also banned from serving on any HOA board in the state for 10 years. The judge said in his sentencing remarks that HOA leadership was a position of trust, and Amy had abused that trust to enrich herself at the expense of her neighbors. He said her actions had caused real harm, and the sentence reflected the seriousness of the offense. The HOA held a special meeting to formally close the investigation. Helen presented a summary of the audit findings and announced that all refunds had been processed. She also announced that the board had voted to donate the remaining recovered funds to a local nonprofit that helped homeowners facing foreclosure. The room gave her a standing ovation. I did not go to that meeting. I watched the live stream from home while my kids did homework at the kitchen table. When it was over, I closed my laptop and made dinner. Later that night, I got a text from Marcus. It said, "You did good." I texted back, "Thanks for the help." He replied, "Anytime." The months that followed were quiet. I paid my HOA dues on time, kept my lawn mowed, and did not get a single enforcement notice. The board sent out monthly newsletters that actually included useful information, like budget updates and maintenance schedules. Helen ran for re-election and won easily. The neighborhood felt different. People waved when they saw each other. The group chat was full of recipe exchanges and yard sale announcements instead of complaints and warnings. I ran into Amy once, almost a year later. I was at the grocery store and I saw her in the checkout line. She looked older and tired. She did not see me and I did not say anything. I paid for my groceries and left. I thought about what Marcus had said about holding people accountable, and I felt like justice had been done. Not perfect justice, but enough. One afternoon I was picking up my kids from school, and another parent asked me if I was the guy from the HOA fraud story. I said yes. She said her neighborhood was dealing with a similar problem, and she asked if I had any advice. I told her to file a records request, document everything, and do not be afraid to escalate to the state. She thanked me and said she would. I realized then that what had happened at Harbor Point was not unique. HOAs across the country were dealing with the same issues. Selective enforcement, abuse of authority, lack of oversight. The system was broken, and it took homeowners willing to fight back to fix it. I started keeping a file of HOA resources. Sample records request letters. State statute references. Contact information for lawyers and auditors. When people reached out, I sent them the file and offered to answer questions. It felt good to help. It felt like the nightmare I had gone through had a purpose. My kids asked me once why I spent so much time on HOA stuff. I told them that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies even when it is hard. I told them that rules are supposed to protect everyone, not just the people in charge. I told them that when you see something wrong, you have a choice. You can ignore it, or you can do something about it. They nodded and went back to their video game. I hope the lesson stuck. The second anniversary of the original enforcement notice came and went. I marked it by sending Helen a thank you card. She texted me a photo of it on her fridge. She said the board was planning another cookout and I should bring my famous potato salad. I laughed and said I would. Looking back, the whole thing felt surreal. A simple fine for a vendor parking violation had turned into a multi-year fraud investigation and criminal charges. But that is how these things work. Small abuses pile up. People stay quiet because they do not want trouble. And then one person says enough, and the whole system cracks open. I am not a hero. I am just a guy who refused to pay a bogus fine and got lucky that other people were willing to help. But I learned something important. HOAs only have the power we give them. When we organize, when we demand transparency, when we hold leaders accountable, they lose that power. It is not easy. It takes time and energy, and sometimes money. But it is worth it. The HOA sent me a renewal notice for my dues a few weeks ago. It included a breakdown of how the money would be spent: landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, reserves. Everything was itemized and transparent. There was even a line item for audit fees. I wrote the check and mailed it without hesitation. I still see Greg at the mailbox sometimes, and we talk about normal things. Sports, weather, kids. He told me the Caldwells got their settlement and used it to buy a camper. He said they were planning to visit next summer and do a big neighborhood barbecue. I said that sounded great. Alan won his board seat. He called me after the election and said he was nervous but excited. He said the board was talking about creating a homeowner advisory committee to review enforcement actions before they went to a hearing. I told him that was a good idea, and I would volunteer if they needed people. He said he would keep me posted. I got one more piece of mail from the HOA last month. It was a letter from Helen. She said the state audit was officially closed, and the HOA had been cleared of any ongoing compliance issues. She said the reforms the board had implemented were working, and enforcement actions were down by 80%. She said the neighborhood was in a good place, and she thanked me again for my role in making it happen. She signed off by saying she hoped I was enjoying some peace and quiet. I am. The house is paid for. The kids are happy. The HOA leaves me alone. I still keep the file of records and evidence in a box in my closet, just in case. But I do not think I will need it. If you are reading this and you are dealing with an HOA that is out of control, do not give up. File the records requests, document everything, find allies, escalate when you have to. The system is designed to make you feel powerless, but you are not. You have rights. You have options. And if you push hard enough, the truth comes out. Amy tried to bury me with fines and threats and procedural games. She thought I would give up or move like the others. But I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless. And when she got careless, I caught her. The minutes contradicted her timeline, and the whole board heard it. She was outvoted so hard the room laughed. The HOA paid my filing fees to end the fight. I got my reimbursement for my expenses tied to the bogus enforcement and the tow threat. And the neighborhood got its integrity back. That is the story. That is how I won. Until the next story, take care, and I will see you next time.